Since it first started tumbling into Ireland through the old pirate coves of West Cork and in the stomachs of drug mules coming from Miami, cocaine has become the drug of our nation. It has swept in like a blizzard, dusting every corner of every small town, and so swift and total has its spread been that the Irish are now some of the biggest users in the world. But to unravel how a small island like ours on the edge of Europe ended up such a big player in the major cocaine leagues, we must follow the white supply lines back to the beginning. We must follow the routes it has taken as it travels across the globe. And most importantly, we need to follow the cowboys who put us on the map. So join me, Nicola Tallant, for my new live show, Cocaine Cowboys, the story of Ireland's love affair with Colombia's biggest export. Limited tickets now available for February 10th at the Lime Tree Theatre in Limerick, February 15th in Cork's Everyman, and at Dublin's 3 Olympia on Sunday, February 18th. Tickets available at venues or on mcd.ie. So, we are going to talk about the Bugsy Malone gang, Ciara, and of course they sort of keep popping up. This was a Dublin youth gang that was around in the 1970s, and the infamous Gerry Hutch was said to be a member of them, which is maybe why they keep popping up and we keep kind of revisiting them. But you did an interesting piece recently, an opinion piece on, why they still matter and what, how we should sort of look on them. So I suppose start off with, let's describe a little bit of where they came from and where they were positioned, what Dublin was like back then.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Bugsy Malones, like you said, Nicola, they were this delinquent youth subculture that came out in Dublin in the 1970s. Now, there's evidence there that suggests it was during the mid-70s, about 74, 75, that they actually kind of emerged or came together as a group. But really, it wasn't until 1977 that they kind of hit public consciousness. And the reason for this, that there was an article published in the Evening Herald by a journalist called Liam Ryan, writing about this Bugsy Malone gang, and he claimed that a group of young people, a group of young lads aged between 11 to 15, had carried out a jump over of Northern Bank on O'Connell Street. So a jump over was kind of like what it says on the tin, that they went into the bank, jumped over the counter and grabbed any cash that was lying there, and then legged it back out again. And so the Bugsy Malones became renowned for these kind of jump overs. And in that first jump over of Northern Bank, they stole about £1,400 at the time, which was quite a substantial sum of money back for 1977. And then 2 years later, the 13-year-old leader of the gang, who was called by newspapers at the time as the Godfather, was arrested by the Gardaí. I suppose the original press coverage very early on was actually, it was very admiring of the Bugsy Malones and almost glorified their activities to some extent. So it described how the Bugsies had carried out this daring raid of the bank and kind of implied that they were outwitting the Gardaí even though they were so young. So that was kind of one of the main activities that the Bugsy Malones became known for back in the 70s. A second major activity was handbag snatching, and particularly in the North Inner City. So there was a junction at Summerhill and Gardner Street. There's a junction, and it became known as Handbag Junction because the Bugsy Malones had developed this kind of elaborate scheme there. So there would be at least 3 of them involved. There'd be one on a rooftop, kind of looking and spotting cars that were coming by. They were looking out usually for lone female drivers, and that maybe the driver had the handbag in the front seat, so that would be easy. There'd be a second Bugsy Malone then at the pedestrian crossing lights, ready to press the buttons so that the traffic lights would turn red and the car would stop. And there'd be at least a third Bugsy Malone nearby then. And so when the spotter on the roof saw this, ideal victim or this car coming forward, they'd signal to the second Bugsy Malone, who would press the pedestrian crossing lights. The lights would turn red, and then the third one would come out, smash the window, grab the bag, and they'd leg it off and kind of divide the spoils at the time. And so again, while there was a degree of planning that went into this type of crime, but at the same time, a lot of what the Bugsy Malones engaged in was very minor level level criminality. And it was really mostly offences against property rather than offences against the person that they carried out at the time.
So tell me this much. Did the media name them the Bugsy Malones, or were they calling themselves that? Because, often, like, there's a lot of this sort of, I think particularly here in Ireland, criminals sometimes have nicknames. Sometimes that's for legal reasons if they can't be named. But often they have nicknames because they've been given them within their own communities and their societies. So what happened in this case?
So in this particular case, you're so right. It did seem to be really an invention by the media. And it was a really convenient invention because the previous year, actually the previous month in December 1976, there was actually a film called Bugsy Malone that was directed by Alan Parker. And that had been released in Irish cinemas just that previous month before this inaugural jump over of Northern Bank. So that 1976 film, it starred a young Jodie Foster, John Cassisi, Scott Baio. It featured a cast of child actors. And it was loosely set, it was based on the careers of Al Capone and Bugs Moran, set in New York in the 1920s during Prohibition. But it was very, like, a really fun and engaging take on the gangster genre. So, for instance, when machine guns in that film hit victims, it didn't hit them with bullets, it hit them with whipped cream instead. So again, kind of that fun and lively take on that gangster genre. And it became really convenient for the Evening Herald to apply this term. I don't think there's anything really unusual about the Bugsy Malones as a subculture, as a group in 1977, 1978. Like this idea, a group of young lads in an urban environment getting up to trouble, that was nothing new in Dublin in the 1970s. It's nothing new today. We still see that happening quite a lot. But there were a couple, I think, of kind of broader social factors in the 70s that made it more convenient and more likely for the press at the time to really pick up on this Bugsy Malone story. Particularly, there was a lot of competition that the Evening Herald was facing at the time. So it was kind of in a big rivalry with the Evening Press. So during the 70s, for instance, the Evening Press circulation, it rose by 10%, but the readership numbers of the Herald dropped off by about 16% during that same period. So that the Evening Herald started engaging in a lot more colourful, a lot more sensationalist stories to try and kind of claw back some of this readership that it had lost to the press. So I think that was one of the reasons why the Bugsy Malones really picked up on it, was this colourful, this eye-catching subculture to kind of discuss.
And as a matter of interest, while you're on that subject there, Ciara, did that work for the Herald? Did they claw back their circulation?
I don't have the exact figures for the circulation, but definitely by 1984, they were still continuing that kind of trajectory. So it does seem that it was somewhat successful, and that they kind of continued that on kind of right into the 80s as well, to gain back that readership that they had lost a bit during the 70s. So in some ways, it was quite a smart move from that commercial side of things and from the press or from the journalistic side of things as well.
It indicate as well maybe that the readers liked the crime stories back then, because, that seems to be the case these days.
Completely so. And like even the popularity of like true crime podcasts and shows as well today, it does show there is an appetite there, and there's always that interest in it. And particularly as well, there were a lot of misrepresentations of the Bugsy Malones in the press, and that probably made them out to be maybe a lot more exciting or a lot more colourful than the reality. So just to give an example, there was this alleged Spanish holiday that the Bugsy Malones took in 1978, which got a lot of press attention from the Herald and from the press and from other newspapers at the time. So essentially kind of what happened is that the newspapers reported that a group of about 12 Bugsy Malones were spotted in Dublin airport, and that they were spotted boarding a plane that was going to Benidorm in Spain. And the Evening Herald at the time, they kind of made it out that the Bugsy Malones were going on this Spanish holiday on the proceeds of criminality, that they had used the money from their handbag snatching and from their jump overs and other crimes to actually fund this holiday. And as you can imagine, it was a bit of a field day for the press at the time. And so the Evening Press, for instance, on the 4th of September 1978, their headline was "Larceny Charged Kids on Spanish Holiday." But again, that was quite a distortion of the true reality. So there was a journalist with McGill magazine at the time, his name was J.J. Molloy, and looked into, they actually did the fact checking behind this holiday and looked into it and found that the holiday had actually been organised by a group of responsible adults from the the inner city, and that they were bringing some kind of deprived kids from the locality with them. And there was 19 people in total that went on the holiday. Just 5 of them were aged under 17, and 2 of these didn't have a criminal record. So in actuality, there was probably only about 3 members of the Bugsy Malones that went on this holiday, and not on the proceeds of criminal activity. And though I suppose the Bugsy Malones didn't really help themselves in some ways. So I interviewed a lot of participants who came into contact with the Bugsy Malones during the 70s, and they reportedly wrote postcards from Spain, and they sent them back to the local Gardaí in Dublin, and also sent them to District Justice Eileen Kennedy, who was judge of the Children's Court at the time. And I never got to see any of those postcards. I was trying to track them down and couldn't find copies anywhere. So I can only imagine what they said, but it probably didn't help this kind of mythology that was surrounding the Bugsy Malones as really young and kind of organized criminals at the time.
So did their reputation and that, kind of, I suppose, cool term around them, did that empower them more than they might have been?
I think we can speculate that it really did. And I should say, look, one of the limitations surrounding the story of the Bugsy Malones at the moment is that unfortunately we don't have any of their stories or their lived experiences on record. And I did try to capture that with my own research. Unfortunately, the arrival of the pandemic during my data collection kind of hindered that ability to capture their stories. So a lot of what we know about them at the moment either comes from the press or comes from kind of the perspectives of participants who came into contact with them at personal, professional levels. But certainly from the evidence we have, it does seem like, the Bugsy Malones weren't necessarily a cohesive gang until the time that the Herald started talking about them. And you can imagine maybe a group of young people growing up in a deprived area, and, the inner city was going through a really difficult period in the 70s due to a variety of factors. But a group of young people who maybe have been marginalized from society, maybe didn't have, much of a standing or much of an identity developed at that time because they were so young. They're now reading about their exploits on the front page of the Herald and on the evening newspapers. And you can, I think, very logically imagine that would have empowered them, and that they came to adopt this Bugsy Malone identity, even though that was a term that was largely kind of superimposed by the media at the time on them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, did your research, for example, suggest that they were a loosely related grouping, and that probably, the naming them created them into a gang rather than the reality of it?
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. So, like, I kind of analyzed this group from the perspective of subcultures. So, looking at kind of localized class-based groups, usually distinguished by age and generation. But with a lot of subcultures, so think like the teddy boys, mods, goths, skinheads, punks, a lot of them can also be distinguished by kind of stylistic and musical preferences. They do stand out. They are quite unique in their time and in their environment. That didn't come to the fore with the Bugsy Malones. And I was searching for that to try and see if there was anything that unique or distinctive there. And there wasn't really. Like, their gathering place was the entrance to St. Mary's Mansion's flats. It was known as the Gate. The main way that interview participants could identify them was because they were all gathered around there. There seemed to be a very fluid grouping. There was at least 6 core members, but people said, look, there could be up to 20 Bugsy Malones, which, isn't a cohesive gang. It's a large group of young people hanging out together that you'd expect to see everywhere. But I suppose what was the term Bugsy Malone, it became a catch-all term in Ireland in the 70s and beyond. And it became symbolic of kind of any juvenile delinquent that was carrying out any sort of deviant or criminal activity in any way, shape, or form. And that kind of how that term has proliferated from the 70s onwards, I think, is a really interesting kind of study in itself as well.
And could you see any actual structure? I mean, they were very young, maybe, to be behaving like an organised crime group. Could you see a structure? You can obviously see 6 key members. Did they have a leader? Did they have, some various layers as such of authority?
I suppose from the perspective of the interview participants I talked to, they did identify one particular member of the group who was the leader, the main persona in that group, and that was Gerry Hutch. So, for instance, one of a local priest that had worked in the inner city at that time that I interviewed, he told this story about Hutch when he was 12 years old. that they were in the classroom, they were in school. A teacher came in and told the class, say, to open their books on page 25. But Gerry Hutch was sitting at the front of the classroom. He turned around to the other young people in the class. He shook his head, and none of them would open their books or obey the teacher in any way. And so that was just one of those many type of stories that participants told me about Gerry Hutch. And look, it's absolutely impossible to verify whether this was accurate in any way, shape, or form. But I think it really does capture a lot of that mythology that surrounds Hutch as this really cool, charismatic criminal, even at the age of 12. And again, you have to think maybe a lot of that was kind of retrospectively superimposed on the Bugsy Malones at the time when we learned more, about Gerry Hutch's career later on. But yeah, it just was really interesting to see that mythology coming about. And of course, Hutch, like as an adult, he became associated with carrying out high-profile robberies, though he was never convicted of them. So the Marino Mart robbery in 1987 and the Brinksdale Depot robbery in 1995. So a lot of people had suggested that maybe his alleged future involvement in those robberies, that maybe that had been grounded in the 1970s in those kind of more small-scale robberies that the Bugsy Malones engaged in. I think another interesting point about Hutch, again, he's actually the only former member of the Bugsy Malones I've come across who has actually confirmed on record that he was a member of this subculture. There was an interview that he carried out with journalist Veronica Guerin back in March 1996. And when talking about the Bugsy Malones, he said that we were kids then doing jump overs, so jumping over bank counters to steal cash, shoplifting, robberies, burglaries, anything that was going, we did it. That was normal for any inner city kid then. So even in that kind of statement, you can almost see him kind of toning down that media furore that's around the Bugsy Malones, just saying that we were just kind of a normal group.
Just kids, yeah.
We were just kids, and we were just doing what other kids were kind of doing at the time.
And he's unique also in that, as you were saying to me before we come on, well, firstly, he's alive and he's still with us, right? So these were kids from a very, very underprivileged place at the time. Like, a lot of those robberies were probably to actually feed themselves or feed their family. These kids probably weren't out there collecting money so as they could go on a foreign holiday. I mean, this was sort of basic needs nearly with them.
I think you're right, Nicola, absolutely. And when you kind of look more into that socioeconomic background that the Bugsy Malones came from as well, I think that point comes out really strongly. So by all accounts, look, they came from deprived backgrounds. And the north inner city where they came from during the 70s, there was very poor housing conditions. There was a lot of overcrowding there. And Dublin Corporation at the time, they're also using this policy of de-tenanting the inner city. So they were moving a lot of residents who had been there for generations. They were being moved and transplanted out to these larger housing complexes in Ballymun, Ballyfermot and Darndale. But I suppose in doing so, they were disrupting a lot of those really strong community ties. Like, some people had lived in the inner city for generations upon generations. Everyone knew one another. But instead that they were kind of breaking up that sense of community, it led to a lot of instability in the inner city at the time. I think that's one of the factors that might have kind of, I suppose, provided maybe greater opportunities for criminality to emerge. At the time as well, there was also very little value placed on educational attainment. So the local primary schools that the Bugsy Malones would have attended was Rutland Street Primary School, but it had the nickname at the time of the Red Brick Slaughterhouse. Which is quite an ominous term for, a local primary school. And really that was because of the really extreme levels of corporal punishment that took place there. Corporal punishment wouldn't be outlined in schools until 1982, but by all accounts, the Bugsy Malones were kind of almost beaten black and blue to a certain extent in school, as a lot of young people were at the time and in that time as well. So as you can imagine, it didn't really encourage them to look at, furthering on or staying in education. There's actually a study carried out in 1978 by Morrissey and Murphy, and they found that about 78% of young people in the North Inner City aged between 15 to 18 had left school at that stage. So they were getting out of school as quickly as they could. Which is maybe understandable, kind of given that wider backdrop of corporal punishment. There was also a lack of legitimate employment opportunities at the time. So manual work on the docks, that would have been one of the major sources of employment for individuals living in the inner city. But because of the introduction of, say, mechanical grabs, there was also the standardization of containers in the 60s and 70s. And this really reduced the need for bodies on the ground or for physical labor. So between 1967 and 1979, the number of cross-channel dockers actually fell from 1,200 to 200. So that route of employment that was largely decimated during the 70s. Major businesses that had been in the inner city, like T&C Martins or like Brooks Thomas, they either shut down or they relocated to, outside the city centre where rent and rates were cheaper out there. So by April 1979, like the unemployment rate in Mountjoy A ward, and it captured a lot of the North Inner City, like Railway Street, Sean McDermott Street, Corporation Street, Buckingham Street, and other parts. The unemployment rate there was 16.2%. So that was about 3 times higher than the employment rate in Dublin County Borough in general. And one of my participants commented that, I suppose, given this deprived background of the Bugsy Malones, like we should be surprised that there weren't more gangs like the Bugsy Malones back then as well. So like you say, you can understand from that background maybe why the Bugsy Malones were attracted to criminality and why there really weren't an awful lot of other legitimate forms of employment for them to pursue when they left school.
Like it's painting a really bleak picture of, and some people are still living in communities, time has passed, the decades have passed, there's a lot of development, but we do and can identify certain communities that kids are coming of age with those same problems. Obviously they're coming from deprived backgrounds, their community's been decimated by a decision to move neighbours out and families, breaking up families probably as they're moving out to those big suburbs. You have an education system which isn't very welcoming for kids coming from those backgrounds. And then to top it all off, how did we punish them as children? We sent them to these borstals and where at least maybe they might have been fed, but that was pretty much it. So that was causing another layer of, I think probably, you could call it a sort of a hatred to society and to people of who are luckier than them in their in their births.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think you raised a really interesting point there about kind of the responses that we had to these groups. And you mentioned Borstals there. There was a particular institution that was actually set up in response to the Bugsy Malones, and that was Locken House. So Locken House had opened as early as 1972 as a prison for young male offenders aged 16 to 21. So it's located up in Blackline in County Cavan. But actually during the period 1978 to 83, it was converted as a place of detention for the Bugsy Malones for young people aged 12 to 16. And now we should note that a lot of the young people detained in Locken House during that 5-year period, they weren't all from Dublin. Like, they were juvenile offenders from Cork, Portlaoise. I think Waterford was one of the addresses of the young people as well. So again, that term Bugsy Malone was a really catch-all one that captured a lot of juvenile delinquents during the period. But the press at the time really linked the opening of Locken House to this original inner city Bugsy Malone subculture at the time. There was a huge amount of opposition to the fact that Locken House was being used for the Bugsy Malone. So there was particularly this interest group called CARE, and the stands for the Campaign for the Care of Deprived Children, had been set up in 1970 to try and lobby for improved childcare services in Ireland. And they were particularly critical of Locken House. So Locken House was staffed entirely by prison officers, again, which wasn't suitable for young people aged 12 to 16. And I should say it wasn't the prison officers' fault. By all accounts, they didn't want to be working there. In the 70s and early 80s, this was a top-down measure. It came from the Department of Justice at the time. Like Locken House, like we say, it was in Blackline, County Cavan, so it was over 170 kilometres from Dublin to Cavan, which made it so difficult for the families of these young people to actually visit them. And again, which you could say undermined, any possible rehabilitation there, that they weren't allowed to keep links with their local community or with their families to the same extent as well. And I suppose as well, it's important to note that at the time in 1978, when it opened, this was a time of economic recession, but by by all accounts, there was a huge amount of money spent on converting Locken House for that 5-year period for the Bugsy Malones. Again, the government never gave the exact amount of money, but we can estimate it would have been about £5 million or so at the time that would have been spent on converting Locken House. And the really sad thing is that Locken House made absolutely no difference in the lives of many of the Bugsy Malones. So in 1985, a journalist at McGill magazine, Mark Brennock, he reflected that all of the first 20 detainees of Locken House had actually served further custodial sentences. So it didn't have any rehabilitative value whatsoever. A lot of these young people became locked in this system of criminality, unfortunately. So yeah, it was a very sad measure. Unfortunately, the government didn't really seem to learn from that at the time. So by 1985, there was kind of a moral panic over young joyriders in Ireland that was taken off. And of course, Fort Mitchell Prison on Spike Island, then it was announced by the government that that would be converted for a place of detention for young offenders, even though like Locken House didn't prove, it didn't seem to make any difference whatsoever. So it's kind of a sad and very kind of maybe narrow-minded view of government policy at the time.
Have you been up to Locken House? Have you visited?
I haven't, and it's still on my list of places to visit.
Well, I'll tell you what, Ciara, it could be as far away from the north inner city and that the whole hustle and bustle, the noise, and I mean back in the 70s when those kids would have been living on top of one another. It's just in the middle of nowhere. I'm saying that now, and people from the area are probably going to ring up and suggest that it is far from that. But it's very rural, you know what I mean? It just feels like it's the edge of the world and surrounded with fields and sheep. And I'm sure, you know, as you mature, it's nice to get out into the countryside. But for a 12-year-old kid being taken from their family and thrown into that environment in a prison seems like a cruelty beyond something. I hope we're talking about this because we're talking about what we can and are learning from our past and from our responses to gangs and to youth subcultures that emerged. But I imagine that all those kids that went there, that they were branded then, were they? That they had been detained in this place, and what a start to life.
Absolutely. I think you're totally right. I think it's that labeling effect, unfortunately, when you're labeled and like you say, branded as a criminal, that unfortunately that can become, not for everyone, but it can become, I think, in a lot of cases, kind of that self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's there as well, which is really sad. And like we kind of mentioned at the start, unfortunately, a lot of the Bugsy Malones just didn't survive beyond the 1980s. So I think there were one or two who were killed in armed robberies in the 70s. There was one in particular in 1982. It was an armed robbery of the B&I ferry terminal in Dublin Port, in which one former member was killed. In 1987, then a robbery of the North Cumberland Street Labour Exchange, in which another member was killed. But I think another one of the major factors that really wiped out a lot of the Bugsy Malones, it seems, was the heroin epidemic that swept through Dublin in the 80s. So heroin first came into Dublin around 1979 or so. And by 1982, there's this terrifying statistic there that about 9% of young people aged 15 to 24 in the North Inner City were actually using this drug, which was absolutely unimaginable and which decimated lives, decimated families, and decimated a lot of that original subculture as well, unfortunately.
And like all those things we've just been talking about, all those deprivations that those kids suffered, you know, and I suppose the world must have felt very unwelcoming for them, and they must have felt they didn't have a place in it. That's really why heroin took a grip, isn't it? Because it was as if it gave them this very warm cuddle, you know, and it just swept in like a blizzard there into the North Inner City. And of course, that was only the first epidemic that wiped out those kids.
Absolutely. No, I think you're 100% right there. It's just a very sad ending to a lot. There's still a number of Bugsy Malones that have survived, but I think for a lot of them, it just was a very sad ending. And one, you know, imagine if that almost £5 million at the time that had been spent in Locken House, if that had been diverted into the North Inner City for, I don't know, day attendance centres or educational projects or employment opportunities, imagine the differences it could have made.
Mm.
It certainly would have made a bit better difference than Locken House, when a lot of the members just ended up later in prison later on in life. But it could have made a huge difference, maybe if different choices, I think, had been made at the time. And that's the frustrating part, I think, when looking back at this history of the Bugsy Malones, just how different things could have been.
And that's one of the things, I suppose, that we should always remind ourselves and learn from that, is that, putting money into preventative measures is always better, isn't it? And these community groups and all these community workers are really the ones who should be getting the funding and the resources, as opposed to sometimes law enforcement. But so what, kind of in an overview, what can we learn from this? What should we kind of recognise we did right or we did wrong? And also, how does this kind of grouping sit today? There are Bugsy Malone gangs still out there now, and are they any different to the ones from the 1970s?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really interesting question. And I think that in terms of what we can kind of learn from the past, or why this group is still relevant today, I think there is that bit of a tendency, to look at the Bugsy Malones, this kind of random youth subculture that emerged in the 70s, and we just kind of compartmentalize them and leave them there and kind of move on. But I think there's a lot that short episode in Irish history can teach us. So I think one of the first is that kind of the moral panic. And so that kind of very disproportionate and very sensationalized response that we saw around the Bugsy Malones in the 70s, that we have to be very wary, I think, when those emerge, particularly surrounding juvenile crime. A lot of the times it results in really dehumanizing language. So I think I mentioned at the start that, the newspapers were originally, they were quite admiring and almost glorifying the activities of the Bugsy Malones. But as you trace that coverage through the newspapers, it became a lot darker and a lot more disturbing over time. At one stage, one of the newspapers quoted a senior detective who claimed the Bugsy Malones were like young rats preying on the public. And again, that use of very animalistic and dehumanizing language to describe a group of young people is doing absolutely nothing to help this group. If anything, it's just marginalizing an already marginalized group even further. So being careful around that type of language, especially in the context of youth crime, I think is really important. And I think a second lesson that we can learn from the Bugsy Malones is that we do need to reduce that empathy gap that can often exist by looking for alternative perspectives. So I think a lot of their history, the media and the press kind of representations of the Bugsy Malones, that's the main kind of caricatures of this group that have survived. But I suppose in kind of capturing other voices of the people who came into contact with them on personal and professional levels, whether prison staff, journalists, youth workers, inner city priests at the time, the politicians, the people who came, might have come into contact with this group, I think can shed a lot more light on their individual and group characteristics. And that was something that came across really strongly from my research, that, a lot of the interview participants described how the Bugsy Malones had lots of positive traits. They were very loyal to people that they respect in the local area. They were really kind. So they showed a lot of empathy to other young people from the inner city into a situation like themselves. They're also really quick-witted, really, really intelligent young people as well. Look, at the same time, they had destructive tendencies there, and there was maybe some violent tendencies that underpinned their behaviour as well. But I think by capturing alternative voices and making sure that the media isn't the only narrative or the only frame through which we understand those youths, I think that's really important in humanising them again and reducing that empathy gap that we all often have between the margins and mainstreams. A third lesson that we can learn that I think we've already kind of touched upon is, look, there is a political tendency there. In Ireland in particular, we over-rely on institutions as this kind of, solution to perceived social problems. We saw that with Locken House, we saw that with Spike Island. There's been work carried out by, Donald and Owen O'Sullivan on coercive confinement in Ireland, and they've looked at direct provision centres as that continuation of using institutions to solve perceived social crises. And usually, there can be a lot of maybe human rights abuses that can emerge in these institutions. It doesn't help the welfare of the individuals that are detained therein. So I think, like you were saying, Nicola, looking at these alternatives to imprisonment and to institutionalisation is something we really still need to learn from, even in Ireland.
I was actually hoping you were going to say we have learned the lessons from that, because I suppose, but we haven't. You're right. You know,
I'm probably being really negative, I know, but yeah, it's probably easier to criticize. And we see so many.
what should we be doing with, you know, groupings like this so young? I mean, you're talking 12 to 16, you're talking children really here. And yet, you know, you can see how they're portrayed still as if that they're sort of underlings in groups. They're the ones who are expected to hold the drugs because they're not going to get, you know, hefty prison terms, and all these sort of myths kind of like surround them. But like, what responses should we be having when we start seeing kids go into these subgroups and gangs, or whatever you'd call them?
I think it comes back to that reason. Well, why is crime so attractive to them? Why are there not other alternative opportunities that they can pursue? I think that alternative, like you're saying, it lies in those opportunities, whether it's educational projects or whether it's apprentice schemes or training schemes or employment opportunities. They have to be able to see a future for themselves that does not rely on crime to pay the bills, or to support their families as well. And look, it's not an easy answer, and I think it's something that we're going to be dealing with for a long time to come. But not locking them up would be probably a really good start.
It certainly would.
Addressing that and investing in alternatives like day attendance centres, educational projects, and along those lines. It's definitely worth a shot, because our current responses, they haven't really proven to be that effective to date.
I was talking to a very significant criminal one time who had made his way up the ranks or whatever, you know, and I was asking him all about his background and about home, and I was really looking for the reasons why, you know. And he said to me that he had two choices in life. One was to become a drug dealer, and the other was to become a drug user.
Oh, guys.
And that said it all to me, didn't it? Because, you know, that wasn't his fault that they were the only two choices he'd see. Obviously, there's so many more choices for everybody, but especially in a country as wealthy and really as privileged as Ireland. I'm saying that having just returned from India, I can recognise it. But I mean, that is all our fault if a child sees those two choices as being their only ones.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think you're so right. And we have to bear in mind those socioeconomic conditions that often underlie criminality. And I think that was one of the problems, and certainly in the press at the time with the Bugsy Malones. These individuals were pathologized as innately criminal. Like it goes back to that almost very positivist mindset. But in reality, you have to pay more attention to those broader socioeconomic structures. But again, that's not really attractive to politicians, because by addressing socioeconomic inequality, that requires a lot of money and a lot of investment, and often something maybe that's, it's probably easier, and it's certainly financially maybe in some ways maybe easier just to blame it on the individual rather than looking at overall state and structural policies as well. So
it's certainly lazier. Tell me this much: that research, where is it? Can people access to read it? Because I would actually love to read it in full.
Absolutely. So I've kind of published the main research in three parts. One is in an article with Irish Economic and Social History, a recent one from last year that's open access, so anyone can read that. Another one is in Irish Probation Journal, in last year's journal. Again, that's open access, free for members of the public to read. And then the third one is it's focused on Locken House itself. It's published with Crime History and Societies. That will be open access by 2025. So it's almost there. We're almost there.
Fabulous. Yes. So well, I'm definitely going to go and immerse myself in that because it's fascinating. I mean, it's bringing in sort of everything which was wrong really in Dublin. And, I work in the North Inner City here, and you sometimes feel that little has changed. Since the 70s, of course, the IFSC has gone up all around the area, and all the promises that were made at the time that there was going to be jobs and opportunities. And of course there were, but not for people from within the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's heartbreaking to hear. Like you say, it just shows that, unfortunately, I think we think as time goes on, that we are progressing and that we are quite modern. But in reality, there's a lot more continuity.
We've a lot more to learn, haven't we?
Yeah.
But, well, look, thanks so much for your time there, Ciara, today. And anybody who wants to read further into that research, you've given us the exact route to read it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Thanks for having me on. Take care.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.